Most of you who are members of the Hub know that every year in February we celebrate the Hub's birthday as well as Darwin's birthday. In 2013, the doors opened officially here with our own space. So Ruth got us a beautiful birthday cake over there for the Hub. And I don't know who's going to blow out the candles, but somebody will. And somebody with a lot of hot air.
Randy?
I wanted to acknowledge the way this started. 21 people put up $1,000 each to open this place, to set up everything that you're seeing. So I wanted to acknowledge the founders that are here today. And would you stand up so people can see you? Tom Barber. Becky Greben. Becky, where's Becky? Barbara Sanwall. Kimberly Saviano. We thank you very much. And now the chair of the board has a few words.
Hi, everyone. We didn't know 7 years ago that we'd be here today. We didn't really know how it would all go, but we're a growing, thriving community. And one of our goals in the coming year is to hopefully relocate and find a bigger space that will allow us to better accommodate families with children, and also to put on more than one event and some larger events and that sort of thing. And so we next week have a quarterly member meeting, and we'll talk more in detail about what we're planning for that. We have a group of people who are committed to helping us solve this problem sometime during the coming year. So that's our next initiative, and I just wanted to mention that so that if you are, you'll hear, if you're a member, you'll hear about it through some email, and then also at the quarterly member meeting next week. So that is it, and I'm going to hand this back to Ev.
Yeah, just curious. You mentioned there were 21 people and you only showed 4. What happened to the guys? Did they leave, or are they just not here because of commitments?
They're not here. But some of them come regularly.
Are they still all members?
No. Some have moved. Some have
Hopefully they didn't convert.
drifted off to. They probably did not convert back.
I don't think they went to the darker side. The man who's responsible for our science programs, which are held the second Saturday of every month, is Dr. Clyde Zadens. He is Professor Emeritus, graduated from Caltech, and until very recently headed up the physics department at UC Denver, UC Denver. So Clyde is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ev. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I want to let you know about some ground rules. Recently, talks have been sort of hijacked by questions that were asked in the middle of the talk. And so I'm going to invoke my dictatorial power as head of the science talks. Questions will be held to the end. Okay? We're very happy to have Dr. Leland Shapiro here. He's a member of the Hub. He grew up in Boston. He did his undergraduate work at Tufts University in psychology and philosophy. He then got his medical degree at the University of Massachusetts. He's had a medical residency at the University of North Carolina and an infectious diseases fellowship at New England Medical Center in Boston. He's currently on the faculty at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and a staff physician at the Denver VA. Lee.
Oh, thanks. So I've been to a number. Can everybody hear me? I don't have a very booming voice. Is that working all right? I don't have a very big voice. I can just move this up. Is that better? Ow! Ah, funny. We got a sense of, you got a comedian here. Can anybody hear me all right? So anyway, this is going to be a different kind of a Darwin Day talk. I've been to a number of these things, as everyone here has as well. And usually it's a series of anecdotes showing how wonderful evolution is in Darwinism, or it's some discussion about some movement like clades, for example, cladistics. And all the talks have been factually excellent, but not what I would call controversial. Here I'm going to try to generate a little bit of controversy in the whole issue of evolution and Darwinism. And in particular, we're all skeptics here, I think. And skeptics should always question what's going on in science. I mean, if you read the stuff around here on the boards and the walls, you might think that, well, you know, Darwin can't be wrong. And what I really want you to do today is think. I'm going to basically divide the presentation into a couple of parts. The first is going to be, most of it, is looking at some real problems that evolution as we understand it has. And then secondly, to try to propose what solutions to these problems might look like. I don't have solutions. If I did, I would be in Stockholm right now getting my award. What I'm doing instead is giving you an idea of what I think a more adequate theory would look like. So with that, we'll get going. I got too many gadgets here. So first, I'm just going to present a sampling of issues with evolutionary theory. And by the way, I'm not the only one who thinks that there are problems with evolution. I'm not alone at all. If you go through the literature, you'll find a lot of people have a lot of issues with what's going on. In fact, Randy Bancroft has an anecdote about Lossos he may want to share later. So anyway, I'm going to talk about a sampling of issues with evolutionary theory, and I thank the organizers, Clyde, Randy Bancroft, and anybody else who decided to show. So here's what I am and I'm not saying. What I am saying is evolution is a very weak scientific theory. It's not false. Theories are not the kinds of things that can be false or true. They are things that are more or less successful. For example, let's take, Newtonian mechanics, gravity. There's almost nothing spookier than gravity. It's as spooky as a deity. Yet it was a very good theory because it was empirically successful. And we can talk about that later if people are interested. We need to do better. We're not going to do better if we all read the walls and believe that this is, the best thing since sliced bread. If you realize there's a problem, that's the first step towards improving the problems. And that's what I'm saying here. What I am not saying, and this is important because it's already been brought up, I'm not saying it's flat out wrong. Theories, again, are not the kinds of things that are true or false. I am not advocating creationism, and several people have already asked me if I'm a creationist. The answer is no, I'm not a creationist. My criticism, evolution is not wrong, it's weak. The beagle? No, that's the beagle. As it turns out, the beagle doesn't exist. It's underwater somewhere, and there are people talking about trying to dredge it up, but it sank. I mean, who knew? And here's an original signed copy of The Origin of Species published in 1859. I actually was going to try to buy the thing, but someone else had beat me to it. Randy. Creation. Now, a word on creationism, because I want to put this behind us quickly. Creationism, or creation science, the problem with it isn't that it's false. The problem with it is that it's not science. And what do we mean by not science? It's not empirically successful, which has three things. The three things are explanation, prediction, and control. Control means building things like this, your cell phone, your TV. Explanation is explaining observations in the empirical world in terms of your theory. And prediction, of course, is doing things like 100 years ago, Einstein predicted gravity waves, and 100 years later, there are gravity waves. When creationists can use scripture and build a cell phone, they've got me hooked. And by the way, I'm not going to go into it here, but, if you think science is about finding the truth of the world and finding factual matters, you better be a creationist. And if anybody's interested in why I say that, ask me at the end. Don't leave yet. It's too early. What is evolution? Biological change over time. Evolution itself is not a contentious issue. There's change all around us. There's a fossil record. We see it happening in real time. I'm a professional infectious diseases practicing infectious disease doctor. I see bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics on a daily basis, so I see this. That's not the issue. We need to, I'm not going to have, these slides are kind of verbose or wordy. I'm going to get away from them very quickly, but these Ground rules are important. What are we talking about when we talk about evolution? So we need a shared understanding intuitively of what the subject matter is, otherwise we don't know what we're talking about. Darwin was careful to differentiate evolution, which is change in critters over time, from natural selection. And natural selection is what he said was his big deal. This was his contribution to the world. And this was the proposed mechanism that explained evolution. He was clear that the law of natural selection was his baby. This was the thing that he gave to the world. Darwin's goal was to account for the fossil record without invoking a designer or God. The more you read about Darwin, the more you realize he was responding to a guy named Paley, who was a big dude in creationism and God and the whole thing about the watch, where a watch would be so complicated it couldn't have happened by chance alone. In the same way, a human body is so complicated it needs a designer. And hence you have this book that everybody talks about by Dawkins, The Blind Watchmaker. A quick word: if it's written by Gould, walk away. If it's written by Dawkins, run away. And if it's written by Lassos, you should read it. So anyway, there are 4 elements to evolution. Reproducing populations, phenotypic or variability in the physical characteristics of the population due to random mutation, natural selection or survival of the fittest. There are a number of ways of recasting natural selection, but they all really boil down to this. Natural selection acts as a filter. Many are called, but only a few get to pass on. That's one way of thinking of it. Where the environment screens for certain attributes adaptations if they're positive, maladaptations if they don't work in passing on the genotype of the organisms that pass the test. Gradualism is very important for evolution in intermediate forms. They always talk about this. And the reason is gradual changes, they say, are more likely than large changes, and that's probably true. Throwing 2 heads is more likely than throwing 100 heads. And what I think is behind this notion is that gradualism is more likely, more probable, more explicable than a quantum change. That is consistent with this notion of random mutation followed by small alterations in the community of organisms followed by natural selection. Neo-Darwinism, a word you see a lot. Very simply, it's just Darwinism plus modern genetics. Darwin didn't know what a gene was. So here's just a quick overview of where I'm going. There are some conceptual difficulties I'm going to talk about, theoretical problems with evolution as we understand it. Natural selection is really weak, and I hope to show you that. It has almost no predictive success and poor prospects for generating predicting success. It has very little explanatory power. And there are lots of these just so retrospective stories, which is really what this concept traffics in, and we'll talk about that. Second is mathematics. Mathematics is the kryptonite of evolution. When you start looking at the probabilities of randomly stumbling upon some of the solutions that I'm going to show you, is not just unlikely, it's inconceivable. And inconceivable means impossible. And people who are proponents of evolution don't really understand, I think, what these numbers look like. Hopefully, I'm going to show you that in a graphic demonstration. Transitional forms, we talked about why they're important. Gradualism is key to these people who believe in evolution. The weird thing is the most important transitional form in the history of evolution has no explanation to this day. And you might wonder what it is. And no, it's not a horse turning into a dolphin. The genome, which is very crucial, ultimately, all changes in evolution boil down to alterations in genes. And if there's random mutation or change, then the genome is a random number generator. It's generating random change. If you look at the genome, people like myself who actually study the genome and look at what it does and how it behaves, it ain't no random number generator. It's a phenotype engine, and we'll talk about what that means. Most importantly, Darwinism has very little to say about frequent striking observations in the real world. And what are they? Convergent or parallel evolution. Everybody knows what this is, and we'll talk about it. Randy Bancroft, I give him credit, invented the term recurrent evolution. Evolution occurs again and again and again, like Groundhog Day. If you don't find that peculiar, don't go into science. It's not for you. Scientists become scientists because they see things in the world that are very unusual and want to figure out how they work. Everybody talks about the diversity of life. I'm going to show you that's the wrong way of looking at it. There is a uniformity of life that's striking, unexpected, and unexplained. Extremophiles are very important. What are extremophiles? Oh, you've read about these bugs that live 10,000 feet under the sea in the top of Mount Everest that have been frozen for like a few million years, billions of years. Things that live in hot springs at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and things that live can survive 3,000 times the lethal dose of ionizing radiation that a human can. Things that can live at 120 atmospheres of pressure. You could probably sit on it, excluding certain individuals, and not kill the thing. Nobody thinks I'm funny. All right. Criticism 1, so let's dig in. Conceptual difficulties with natural selection. I'm not the first person to bring this up. This is a classic problem with Darwinian evolution. Natural selection basically says whatever will be, qui sera, sera. Survival of the fittest, let's talk about what this means. The central element, the thing that Darwin says was my baby, my contribution is natural selection. It's been criticized as a tautology. And when you read what this is and what the criticisms are, it's kind of a mixed bag, and they're conflated issues. I don't even think that's the problem. The problem is far deeper than that, but let's go with the tautology for now. A tautology is saying, by the way, NS is natural selection, the same thing twice but using different words. For example, John is not only a bachelor, but he's also an unmarried man. That doesn't tell you much about John, does it? It tells you the same thing. Tautology often refers to a truth which cannot be false. John is a bachelor or he is not a bachelor, P or not P, for those who like logic. So how does this work for natural selection? Well, let's look at what natural selection looks like. Okay, survival of the fittest. I want to know what fitness means. If you're a scientist, you want to know what does that mean, right? Okay, fitness is defined by those which survive. Okay, but why did that animal survive? Well, it survived because it was fit. Well, wait a minute, why was it fit? Well, it was fit because it survived. In other words, and I'll show you a graphic example with my favorite animal, the cheetah. But basically, it just says, if I were to take a mix of animals and say which one was fit, they're going to say, well, come back in 20,000 years and I'll show you. And I'm saying, wait a minute, I want a little more than that. Survival of those who are better equipped for survival is a tautology, or so it is claimed. As I point out, that isn't even the big issue. The big issue is worse than this. Tautologies, unfortunately, say nothing about the world. They are true regardless of circumstances. Saying an animal is fit because it survived and that it survived because it is fit tells us nothing about the animal. I want to know why. Is it faster? Is it stronger? Is it bigger? Is it smarter? Does your cat having 6 toes help? Everybody knows about that. If you're a cat person, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not even going to read this. I've read about 15 different ways to resurrect this thing and recast it in a way that works, and none of them work. None of it helps. You end up with the same problem that you started out with. And by the way, as I said, I'm not the first person or the only person that finds this as a problem. I'm not sure what the real problem with natural selection is, that it's the tautology. I don't even really care, to be honest. Instead, I think the heart of the problem is that natural selection is devoid of empirical content. It offers no meaningful description of what it means to be fit or more fit. Seems to say that something is fit if it survives. Let me give you a few examples of this. And I want you to look at this sentence, survival of the unfit. That's a screwy sentence, and you should say, what is he talking about? Take a look at the statement. It says it is weird, bizarre, self-contradictory because the unfit cannot survive, by definition. Natural selection seems that survival of the fittest cannot be contradicted by empirical observation. You cannot find an animal that's unfit. How did it get there? Conclusion. Natural selection, in a sense, legislates against possible contradictory observations. This is an especially disturbing form of unfalsifiability. And in fact, Sir Karl Popper, the falsifiability guy, hated evolution for this reason. He said, Darwinism does not really predict the evolution of variety. It therefore cannot really explain it. And I agree with him here, but not for the reasons he thinks. Related problem is prediction. Really good theories predict stuff. Newtonian mechanics did it, Einstein did it, quantum did it, All the good theories do it. And in fact, the ability to predict allows you to do things like make automobiles, cell phones, televisions, and whatever else we have here in the modern world. Let's take cheetahs. Cheetahs are interesting for a reason that I'm going to come back to that may be surprising to the group. Can natural selection predict which will survive over time? No, it can't. For example, you look at a population of cheetahs. Some are faster, some are smarter, some have better vision. Some are more social. Lions are the only social cats, by the way. Maybe polydactyl, like your cat has an extra toe. Who's going to survive? Who's fittest? Does anybody know? No. What I'm looking for is a rule. Like, for example, survival of the fastest. Well, if that's the true, I know who wins. This guy wins, right? This is what evolution looks like. You want to know why the surviving cheetah, what the surviving cheetahs have that the other guys don't have. Why are they fitter? You want to know characteristics of the filter, which is natural selection is considered a kind of filter. And you want to know qualities of that filter. How big are the holes? How many holes are they? What shape are they? What are they filtering for? So you got our faster, smarter, better night vision, polydactyl, larger litters. Who wins? How many? Why? How long will it take? I don't know. I want a theory that starts telling me these things. And before you say it's impossible, I would say, no, it's not impossible. And I'll show you why in a moment. Why cheetahs? Well, because anything that can go 0 to 70 in 3 seconds is cool. Did you know that all cheetahs are identical twins? There is no genetic variability in cheetahs. This completely goes against natural selection. That talks about genetic variability being the substrate for survival. These guys have survived how many million? I don't know how many years they've survived, but they're here with us, and yet there's no genetic variability. One should ask, well, why? Why is this? Why do you have this weird exception? Summary of criticism 1. As I said, I'm going superficially, very quickly through a series of criticisms. Explanatory deficit of natural selection. Why do some survive and others do not? Are we certain there are not rules like survival of the fastest? And if there are, don't we want to find them? I do. If there are such rules, don't you want to know what they are? Are there exceptionless regularities that appear in all survivors, like foot speed? This will surprise you. If this doesn't keep you from leaving to the exits, nothing will. I'm going to show you that life has exceptionless regularities with 0% variability, and everything that has been alive from the beginning of this planet until today have them. If that doesn't strike you as odd, then you don't go into science. It's not for you. If that doesn't need explanation, then you're not thinking. If you think Darwinism can explain that, you're just wrong. So I'll just leave it at that. So as you can see, I'm saying then America, everybody's seen this picture. It's like, okay, you get some guys who, you get some variability and then some survive and some don't. There's a missing point there. There's a filter, but I don't know how this filter works. It's like stuff just happens. A lot of evolutionary biology resembles anatomy, a primarily descriptive field devoid of mechanistic explanation. Just describes stuff. And then people say, well, this animal survived obviously because this one did that and wanted to make, there's no prediction there. It's just making up a story after you see the facts. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Some of natural selection, stuff just happens, and no one seems to know why. It's weak science. Not wrong. Theories are not right or wrong, but weak. Unless this is realized, we're not going to make any progress in improving them. The possibility of contradictory data is legislated out of existence. Since there are no rules, they can't be broken. Or, anybody here remember Dr. Dealgood from Thunderdome? He says, and I quote, "I know you won't break the rules. There aren't any." So the reason you can't find contradictory data is because you can't find contradictory data. The game is rigged against you. Let's talk about mathematics, the kryptonite of evolution. Random mutation or undirected change is pivotal in most conceptions of Darwinism. Why is that the case? Eliminating agenthood. The reason evolution was really created was because they wanted to move away from a deity, and in that Darwin succeeded. He actually said this should be brought into the realm of physical natural sciences and out of the realm of of theology, and that was a good idea. The wheels came off after that, however. And as I said, a lot of what he did was in response to Paley, who was a theist. But what if evolutionary change is not or cannot be random? If true, evolution needs revision to explain how it is not random and how these things arise in organisms. If you're not sure about this, let's take an example. So if it's not random, now you've got natural selection, whatever that is, acting on non-random things being served up to it. Since what comes out is a function of what goes in, you want to know what the rules are. If it's not random, it's rule-based. You want to know the rules, right? Thank you, Randy, that's all right. I'm going to talk about, don't read the stuff, I'm going to explain it to you. This is an area I know very well. This is a receptor on a cell. Here's a cell, is a nucleus. That's my best art I can do. Here's a cell surface, here's the nucleus. This is a protein sitting on the cell surface that's called a toll-like receptor, blah, blah. It's a cool receptor. It accounts for something called innate immunity. It's how you recognize bacteria, viruses, fungi, and pathogens that invade. They're really peculiar. They have a very, very unusual capacity. They can recognize pieces of organisms that never, ever, 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 ever change. Come back to that, maybe. But all I care about now is I want to talk about how to build it, because I know this. There was a time in evolutionary history it didn't exist, and now it does. And I also know a lot about it. It's about 1,000 amino acids. Amino acids are these 20 building blocks of proteins. You might ask yourself, why 20? These numbers, I want you people to start thinking about these weird numbers. 20? Why not 30? Why not 15? Why 20? Do you think it's random? I don't. Anyway, let's look at how you built this thing up. Now, I want to talk about how it works. Remember, this is back, by the way, it's bigger than actual size. Bacteria is smaller. Just want to be sure we get that. So what these receptors do is bacteria periodically spew out little pieces of themselves. They're kind of like pooping along. When they replicate, pieces, get spilled out. And here's a molecule from a pathogen, in this case, a bacterium, say E. coli. And what happens is this receptor engages it. It then dimerizes, which means two identical pieces are pulled together, and that generates a change in the conformation of what's going on inside the cell. You get signaling to the DNA and stimulates the DNA to make molecules which are responsible for killing the bacteria. Does everybody see this now? These pattern recognition receptors are designed to recognize foreign invaders where they don't belong, like in your blood or in your lung, and then they stimulate production of an inflammatory and immune response to kill the bug. Everybody with me? Good. So that's what they are. Now, that's what they look like. It's really cool. They're just big enough to put a piece of DNA between them, or a piece of endotoxin or surface of bacteria. They're really cool how they work. They're just designed perfectly. So let's talk about how you would build this receptor. It's got 1,000 spots or amino acids. This is a known fact. And you've got 20 amino acids. Let's look at some numbers here. So let's build it. Okay, there are 20 positions there. There are 20 there. There are 20 there. There are 20 there. And all the way around for 1,000. How many permutations or possible numbers of these receptors where order doesn't count can you make? Well, the answer is obvious. It's 20 times 20 times 20 times 20 times 20 times 20. And the number is, and I actually think I wrote it here, 1,000 amino acids. I think I skipped it. Hold on. I can't do it. It's 20 to the 1,000th power. 20 times 20 times 20 to the 1,000th power. And what you end up with is the following. There are only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the whole universe. You're beginning to realize how small that is compared to the number I just told you. Bottom line, if every elementary particle in the universe were a factory and started making this receptor, somehow could synthesize them at a plant, since the beginning of the known universe, 13.7 billion years, you'd have to create this many receptors every second just to get to my number, 20 to the 1,000th power. It's impossible. The point being that, look at this number, that's to the 1,000th power. Every proton, neutrino would be a factory putting these things together since the beginning of time, and that's how many per second you would have to make. This is not improbable, this is impossible. This can't be done randomly. If you think it's random, it's an illusion. And why is it an illusion? Because the receptor is here. It made the scene. Somehow it got here. And while I'm not going to tell you how it did get here, I am going to tell you how it didn't get here. Random mutation. The evolution of this receptor by trial and error is not reasonable. A different kind of explanation is needed. Now, if you know about evolutionary biologists, you know what they're going to say. It's kind of like a global warming denier. You know where they're going to go with this. They're going to say, oh, well, it's obvious how it got here. You lock in small little incremental gains that have another function, and then those functions accumulate over time until you build up the whole receptor. That's a big part of how they explain complexity. For those who like terminology, this is called exaptation or pre-adaptation, and the classic paper is by Gould and Verba. You can look at it if you like. This is kind of how it works. You start with a random piece that has a survival advantage. Then over time you build it up, you build it up, you build it up until the whole thing appears. Can't be true. Here's why. Can't be true because, number one, there is no adaptive advantage to any of these little pieces of receptor. Receptor nubbin doesn't help you. There is no survival advantage. There's no adaptation. There's not a reason in the world to think it's true. There is nothing like this in the fossil record. And if you look at animals and plants and everything today, you do not find pieces of receptors floating around on the surface. They don't exist. It's the whole enchilada or it's nothing. This concept of pre-adaptation is just wrong. It just can't be right. Now, if you think that was something, wait till you hear this story. I'm not going to read it to you because I know the story by heart. The animal in the background is a wasp called the jewel wasp. And here I'm going to show you a crazy complex series of behaviors. Now, behaviors are more complicated than simple proteins because behaviors are polygenetic. Things like anger, things like things like intelligence, they all say, oh, it's polygenic, it's multiple genes. Makes the problem even harder. Let me tell you what this guy does. This wasp has a peculiar activity regarding cockroaches. Cockroaches don't like this guy, and I'm going to tell you why they don't like this guy. It finds a cockroach, grabs it. The first thing it does is it stings it in the thorax in one particular area, and it basically paralyzes the front legs of the cockroach so they can't move. So it's helpless. Then it turns around and stings it in the head twice. Wait to hear this story. It puts the stinger in the head and it fishes around till it finds one little tiny cluster of neurons. Then it injects a tiny amount of venom, just enough to basically alter the function of the neurons. And what does it do? Well, then the wasp runs away and watches. What happens is the cockroach grooms itself for 30 minutes. Then it sits there like a zombie. This is peculiar. What it does is deactivates the ability or the will of the cockroach to run away. How do we know that? It has full motor function. If you look at it, if you take it and you actually test it, it can do whatever it wants, but it doesn't want to do it. Somehow, whatever volitional actions the cockroach wants to take are destroyed by this sting. Then what the jewel wasp does is it goes to the front of the roach and it grabs the antenna, not making this up, and pulls it. And for some reason, the cockroach is forced to follow the wasp like a dog on a leash. You can't make this stuff up. It then drags it into the wasp drags the cockroach into a nest and puts one egg on the cockroach's body. Then, as it turns out, there's another trick that the venom has. It slows down the cockroach's metabolism so it can live 2 weeks without food. Normally it can't. Then, as it turns out, the roach can still move, but not if it wants to. It has no volitional ability to move. The larva then, the egg hatches and the larva then eats the cockroach and the cycle repeats itself. Now, I want to show you how bizarrely precise this is. cockroach is a pretty small, hideous little ant. Hard to feel bad for these guys. It's fishing around for these tiny little nerve clusters in the roach. How precise is it? Let me show you how precise it is. If you remove those tiny little nerve clusters in the head of the cockroach, the wasp spends all this extra time looking for it. It somehow senses when it finds it. It actually penetrates the cell layers in such a way to get right into the right ganglia and puts just enough, not a lethal dose, but just enough venom in to deactivate the roach's capacity to run away. It's an amazing experiment. What these guys did is this ganglion, which is the target, if you leave it in, this is the amount of time the stinger is in the head looking for the gang. It finds it pretty quickly. If you remove it, look at this. It goes from 20 seconds to 200 seconds, fishing around, looking, and it can't find it. Now, what's going on here? Think about an evolutionary story of trial and error of behaviors trying to go from A to B here. Not only that, show me the transitional forms. Show me where the wasp first does the first sting and then nothing else. Or the first sting and then maybe the second. Or maybe the second and not the third. And then figuring out, well, if I grab the leg, it'll do that. If I grab the back, and then I'll grab the antenna, oh, look, this works. There's no evidence for any of that. This is, oh, by the way, just to point out, that's the brain of the wasp. It's not figuring a whole lot out. Anyway, the point I'm making is I don't know how this happens, but I'll tell you how I don't think it happens. I don't think it happens by random behavioral changes followed by natural selection. If there's a way to tell that story, I haven't seen it. And I don't think such a story can be told. And all I can say is if you think it's true, if you think that's the way it works, good luck. How random genetic mutations can account for complexity in evolution is difficult to imagine. The number of possibilities gets too big too fast. Attempts to explain this by pre-adaptation or ex-adaptation do not succeed. Maybe a model of random changes followed by natural selection can be produced, but none is currently available, and I don't think it's going to work. Somehow there are constraints or restrictions that are operative on possible dead-end possibilities that must be imposed. In other words, there have got to be ways of eliminating 99.999999% of all the possible ways this can happen. They're not random at all. These are directed. The question is directed how and by whom or by what. Transitional forms. Transitional forms are important for evolution because, as I pointed out, everybody wants to show that there are small doable changes and not undoable changes. The biggest transitional form, and I'm going to just skip ahead here, this is the most difficult transitional form to explain. You have prokaryotes or bacteria, and then you have eukaryotes, which are cells like we have. The difference is the cells we have this very sophisticated, intricate, rich network of intracellular organelles, a nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, lysosomes. They don't occur here. The problem is there is no transitional form from one to the other. There's no bacterium with a nucleus. It doesn't exist. It's like bacteria came, evolved, and then all of a sudden the eukaryotes came out of nowhere. There's been recent talk about Loki or Loki archaeum, that they say maybe a transitional form, and the answer is no. I find that completely unpersuasive. The most important transitional form of all, prokaryote to eukaryote, or bacteria to human-type cells, is not shown. The importance of transitional forms is linked to the commitment to gradualism implied by small random genetic changes. What if both gradual and rapid or quantum changes occur during evolution? Darwinism must explain this. I have no problem with big changes occurring. Darwinism does, because after all, it's got to be random, and random must be small. This is interesting. The genome itself, the more we learn, remember, Darwin didn't know about the genome. It was undiscovered at that time. Everybody knows this is DNA. You have these base pairs going to each other. Let me show you how DNA actually changes over time. You get inversions where pieces come out, flip around, and then go back in. Here's another one. Duplication. Whole piece of DNA duplicated, and then insert themselves into the genome. Duplication is important. It's crucial for people who evolutionary biologists. Why? Because if you're going to go from 5,000 genes to the 20,000 we have, you need to build up the number. This is one way of doing it. It's also a way of putting a stash of pieces of genome into a space in the DNA that you can operate on. You can mutate, you can change them in a way that may be useful while keeping the original copy to run the cell itself. Here's another one, which people may know. This is called translocation. A piece breaks off here, a piece breaks off there, and then they swap. Oh, and by the way, the places where they break are not random. They're called DNA hotspots. In fact, the HAP map is a whole consortium of people who look at pieces of DNA that are unusually prone to these kinds of alterations. This is the most interesting one of all, and this is something I specifically put in for Randy. This is an amazing study by a guy named Drake. No, not the planetary guy, a different Drake. He looked at the genomes of these guys here. They're basically viruses, fungi. That's all you got to know, viruses and fungi. And he looked at the genome size and base pairs, and the difference between them is about 6,500, from the smallest to the biggest. Note the log scale. He looked at the mutations per base pair, per position within it. The difference is about 10,000 from the most to the least. Here's the shocker. He then did a calculation of the number of genetic changes per entire genome, and the numbers are almost identical. It's 1.3. In other words, the genome appears to be titrated for a certain amount of mutation for every single thing on the planet. Summary: DNA is not a random number generator. If true, Darwinism must account for this, since it will affect what is served up for natural selection, what's in here. Perhaps changes have a directional purpose that can help explain recurrent evolution, exceptionless regularities, etc. In other words, it's not a random number generator. It's probably a phenotype engine. Whole pieces of DNA are moving around, and those pieces contain things like proteins that become attributes. The genome is not randomly doing things. If it were purely random, it would be chaos and nothing would ever get done. I want to know what tasty bits are served up from the genome for natural selection that go through the filter and make my cheetah. This is the coolest one. Recurrent evolution, or Groundhog Day. We all have heard about convergent evolution. Oh, the octopus eye and the human eye, we've all heard of that. It's weirder than you might think. If you like evolutionary biology, read this book by Lassos. It's the best evolutionary biology book I'm aware of. Independent development of similar features in different species. Yogi Berra said, of course, it's deja vu all over again, or it's Groundhog Day all over again. Convergent evolution is very well described. In fact, Lassos points out that convergent evolution is not the exception, it is the rule. That things recur over and over and over again in very unrelated species that have no common ancestors whatever. Eyes, here's some examples. Mammals and cephalopods or octopi, we all know this. Caffeine has evolved 3 separate times, at least that we are aware of, in plants that have no genetic heritage in common. Surface spines on porcupines, echidna, hedgehogs, fingerprints in the koala bear and primates. Social or colony organizations, here's the creepiest of all, one of the creepiest. Ant colonies and termite colonies are very similar, right? A queen, workers, swarmers. They have egg chambers. They cultivate fungi. You might think that a termite is like an ant. No, termites come from wasps. They have no evolutionary history in common whatever. None. And yet somehow, not only is the morphology converged, but the entire social structure of these bugs is all but identical. Almost can't be distinguished. Repeated loss of flight in birds. People probably read about the rail and all this. The bird keeps coming back over and over, and it keeps losing its ability to fly. Here's a striking example. This is actually very telling. Lassos has an example of 3 different islands with 3 different lizards which have no genetic heritage in common. And yet what they find is that the lizards have evolved to live on land, on the tree bark, and on the leaves of the tree, and they look identical. There's no difference that you can see with the naked eye. Why is this important? It's important because don't think islands. Think different planets. Think of the world. Stephen Jay Gould famously said, if you start the world over again, evolution takes a totally different pathway. You get the stuff in Star Trek, right? You get silicon-based hordes, and you get weird animals. You get ugly wugglies. Yeah, really ugly wugglies. Lasso says no. You get the same thing every time, and here's why. These guys here are basically, it's like the planet Earth reset, 3 separate planets going together at the same time, and they all do the same thing. If you restart the world, it's the same thing. It's like you just go to a different island, same conditions as the Earth, and what he says is evolution will follow the same path. Here's Stephen Jay Gould in the background, and I talk about this. Then I'm not going to go into it any further. Basically, there's a case to be made that evolution follows the same path when you restart it every time. Convergent recurrent evolution summary. Life follows a plan or a path that recurs over and over again. If the world was sent back in time and restarted, we would end up pretty much as we are today. It seems wildly improbable that life can blindly stumble upon the same complex solutions over and over and over. Does it say something about the world or about biology? What do I mean by that? Well, does life follow the same path because, like, laws of physics say it can only go in a certain way? Or are there options, and for whatever reason there's an instruction set that says, no, you're going to go in this direction? No one really knows what the answer is, but I'll give you at the end what I think is going on. So here's primordial Earth. 4.5 billion years later, you get where we are now. If you rewind the clock, you end up where you started. And by the way, I'm not a big fan of this stuff. Randy loves these things. These little Martian landers running around. NASA looks for life like us, carbon-based, uses mass spec and test looking for life to be the way we have life on this planet. Why? Because of ideas like convergent evolution. Like if you have a different planet, it's going to converge along the same plan that it does here. I hate to admit it, but NASA's got it right here. This is the right thing to do. It's exactly the right thing to do. It's separate from the argument that says it's too much money to do it a different way, or you wouldn't know where to begin. You don't know where to begin because I don't think there's another way to begin. Everybody knows Groundhog Day? Recurrent evolution is more than a curiosity. It's spooky. It should never happen, yet it occurs all the time. And Darwin has nothing to say about this. If this doesn't interest you, don't go into this field. Evolutionary biology is not for you. Do something else. There's got to be an explanation for this, and it's not going to come from Darwin. Now, this is one of my favorites because it's original, I hope. Everybody talks about the diversity of life. You know, here in the background, oh my goodness, we have horses, dolphins, ants, spiders, humans, whales. However, I like to look at things in a different way. Looked at in a different way, there's a striking regularity that really is creepy. It's downright creepy. Every single living thing on this planet is carbon-based, needs water. Amino acids can have 2 configurations based on handedness. They're all L and never D. ATP is the currency of energy. Everything that's living on the planet uses it. Nucleic acids to store and propagate information. There's no animal that uses a silicon crystal or some weird thing to transmit information. The genetic code is all about identical in every single animal, no matter what you look at. Ribosomes, things that make proteins. Amino acids, it's the same 20. It's only 20, and it's the same 20 over and over and over and over. Narrow pH range, mitochondria, I'm not going to go into all the details. My point is, when you see something in the world that has no exceptions, you need to ask some questions. This needs explanation. This is why people go into science, is you see things like this and say, what is going on here? What is the explanation? Let me tell you, you're not going to find it. Darwinian evolution. Here's also what's interesting. These regularities run through extremophiles I'm going to talk about next. Extremophiles are animals, usually bacteria, that live under extreme conditions of temperature, elevation, pressure, heat, pH, salinity, ionizing radiation, and I'm going to show you some of these. But here's what's peculiar. Despite every conceivable motivation to change the way they do business, they don't change these regularities, they defend them. If there's time at the end, I can show you how Deinococcus radiodurans that can survive 3,000 rads of ionizing radiation. And what it does is interesting. Its DNA is chopped up just like ours is, just as bad, just as much damage is done. What it's developed is a very fast, very sophisticated way of repairing it quickly in ways that we can't. Instead of changing the DNA into a molecule that's radio-resistant, it defends the regularity that can't be changed. I'm going to skip this. I want to go to the upshot. Life appears to have a blueprint or an instruction set or a plan. If a spaceship landed in the White House, anybody recognize this space? It's a Jupiter 2 from Boston Space. If a spaceship lands on the White House lawn and the door opens, what comes out? Some ugly wuggly from Star Trek or Star Wars? No. What comes out is us. Not exactly like us. In some cases, I hope. No, I'm not getting through here. But let me tell you what they're like. Carbon-based ribosomes, nucleic acids, 20 amino acids, L and not D. Do you see where I'm going with this? These uniformities appear to be something that goes across the entire universe. Why do I say that? When I see extremophiles that are 20,000 leagues under the sea or on Mount Everest, or something that resists awesome amounts of radiation, I think of other planets. And I think as harsh as conditions are on other planets are what we have here. And yet we have no alteration in these exceptionless regularities. It's rare in science that we see exceptionless regularities, and they're right under your nose. Extremophiles. So I'm not going to show everybody hears about these. They live in ice, they live in deep sea anoxic lakes, hydrothermal vents, hot springs, volcanoes, deserts, and what have you. This is just from a wonderful book, from a wonderful article in Frontiers in Microbiology. And look at some of these numbers that these guys can survive in. Look at the temperatures. I mean, we're talking about 252 degrees, salinity of 25%, 99 degrees. You're talking about a pH of negative 0.06. Who's ever seen a pH of negative 0.06? It's unheard of. That's 8 orders of magnitude different from what we have in our bodies. Like, are you kidding me? pHs of 11, that's almost off the scale. I mean, it goes to 14. And this guy goes to 12.5. It's unheard of. Pressures, 1,250 atmospheres. You could sit on the thing and you wouldn't damage it. It might push you back. Here's my favorite, Deinococcus radiodurans. 1,500,000 rads, or 13,000 times more than a human can tolerate. Every one of these bugs defends and does not change those exceptional regularities. If anybody were going to do it, these guys would do it, and they don't. And I'm telling you, they don't because they can't. Extremophiles succeed by defending my exceptionalist regularities, all these things here. They do not succeed by altering the regularities. For example, maybe you could get silicon-based surface so that you could resist radiation, or a covalently based genome so that it wouldn't be ripped apart by all these harsh conditions. Is there a message here? Yeah, I think there's a message here. What is it? These are the only pathway life can follow, and no deviation is permitted. If you do, you die. They are required essentials. Required by what? That's the question. This is where things get interesting. Is it the laws of physics? That life simply can't go in a different direction because they'd have trouble dealing with gravity or pressure or whatever? Is there a blueprint? Could life be different, but the blueprint says it's going to be in this direction? It's like you have the parts to make a car, but the blueprint says you're going to make a Tesla. That's it. You could make a Chevy, but you're going to make a Tesla. Elements of both, maybe. By the way, I'm not going to go into this, but it's conceivable that you could say, well, you know, maybe way back when conditions were different and they just happened to go in this direction and can't backtrack. Not true. These guys are around since the dawn of time, since the dawn of life, and you can backtrack. Birds can lose the ability to fly. Mitochondria in your cells have completely lost the panoply of genes it takes to live independently, and they're now become parasites dependent on us. Parasites live in your gut, despite the fact they've lost all kinds of evolutionarily gained functions. So you can go backwards. Reverse evolution is a real thing. And my point is, if they could have done it, they would have done it. And that's Devo, the truth about de-evolution. Now, if you've gotten this far, I've gotten as far as I want to go. Now I'm going to finish up with some speculation, some real speculation. I don't know what the answer to these questions is. All I want you to do is think that there's something missing in Darwinian evolution, that there are some problems that need to be solved. Evolution is shot through with regularities, patterns, organizing principles, rules, and laws. These underlying processes are not the result of evolutionary progress. They are the reason evolution occurs at all. It's the thing that limits those probabilities that are off the charts. Darwinism lacks the tools, the horsepower required to address these issues. If they're not of interest to you, a career in science is probably not your thing. So let's talk about some potential answers of what this is. Now, I'm going to skip all this because I've harped on it enough. So we have creationism, we have Darwinism. I don't think either is satisfactory. You need a third alternative, another pathway. What is it? I think there's a plan here, but there's not a planner. The planner is the world. The world is the planner. The universe is the planner. What do I mean by that? There is information, there are rules, there are regularities in the universe. Don't think that's true? Let me give you some numbers. The speed of light is a number. There it is. The universe is loaded up with constants that are very, very specific numbers, whether it's Planck's constant or G or the gravitational constant. There's a number of them. Very peculiar facts show up, like quantum levels around nuclei that are very, very specific and very, very quantitative. Why they're there, I don't know, but they are there. Higher order laws also exist. Relations, regularities, things like F equals ma equals mc squared, F equals g m1 m2 over r squared, many, many, many others. These are things that are built into the fabric of the universe. They were born at the time of the Big Bang. Are the regularities, laws, organizing principles that apply to evolution, and circumvents the mathematical problems of too many possibilities. That's one of the problems we got. Accounts for parallel evolution and exceptionist regularities, things that are baked into the universe itself. Let's see, I'm going to skip this. Now, see the watch in the background? This is Paley's watch. Paley's watch was the big thing between Darwin and Paley, a big fight over this. And Paley said, if you stumbled upon a watch, you'd say it's too complex to have occurred by random chance alone. It has a function, and God had to create the function. Darwin, and especially Dawkins, is saying, no, no, no. Given gradualism in sufficient time and random changes, you could build a watch. The watch is a bad example because, no, that can't happen. But that's not the point. I'm going to try to draw an analogy. This will hopefully be the final thing. I have 2 points to make, so I know we're almost at the end. I want to show you my watch. And this is for Clyde. I have a different watch. I'm going to show a special watch that I invented. Here's my watch. My watch is a solar system. Let's take a look at the solar system. It's very precise. It has all kinds of complicated motions about it. It tells time pretty darn good. We used to have sundials, and they spin around at a very predictable speed and periodicity. Think about people in ancient Greece or whatever looking at a solar system if they could do it. They'd say, wow, look at all those regularities. The planets are all spherical. How come they're not disks? How come they're not cubes? How come they're not any one of 100 billion, trillion different shapes I can imagine? How can this be? Look at how complex it is. It tells time. It has all these predictable regularities. You can plot them to the minute, and sure enough, it's going to be there. Not only that, this parallel evolution. Everywhere I look, I see these things. In fact, I see 10 to the 24th. Well, this is the number that's estimated. There are 10 to the 24th solar systems in the universe estimated. I want to draw a parallel. That's where we are right now with evolution. We see these numbers that are huge, that we think are possible, but they're not. The laws of physics tell us why these things are spherical. The laws of physics tell us why we don't see intermediate forms. You don't see a third of a sphere, then a tenth of a sphere, then a fifth. In other words, the laws of physics take that away from you. You don't need intermediate forms. And we know why. We see parallel solar systems all over the place. What we need, and I'm not the only one, we need an Einstein who looks at the regularities going on in evolution and makes the leap from turning this into something that you can't understand to something that's perfectly consistent with the natural world, and all the problems go away. The final thing I want to talk about is another idea of how to get around some of the problems. It's modularity. Remember I told you about the genome? Whole pieces are moving around, whole chunks. Remember we talked about parallel evolution, we talked about intermediate change, we talked all these things, and exceptionist regularities. What if evolution works at the level of modules? Big chunks. Here are some modules that I just threw together for nothing. Here's if you look at them at the level of amino acids, and here's look at them at the level of nucleic acid base changes. Look at the permutations, how quickly they grow. There are too many possibilities here to get anything done. It can't work that way. It's impossible. What I'm claiming is that maybe there are modules of evolutionary change, behavioral, genetic, phenotypic, at the level of proteins. And these modules, which are independent units or components that can be combined or mixed and matched. And there are few enough modules that there's a finite number, that there are certain modules which occur over and over, that in terms of parallel evolution, there are few enough modules that they can all stumble upon the same solutions to the same problems. I'm not going to show you this. I'm going to tell you what's going on here. If you don't believe in modularity, I'm going to try to convince you that it's real. This is a wonderful study. It's fun. That's why I have it here. Dogs had a problem. The dog problem was because we have black dogs that didn't follow any of the genetic rules that they should. There was a molecule missing. That's all I'm going to tell you. If you want, I can tell you more about it later. There's a molecule missing. And they found the molecule, and it's sitting right here. It's called beta defensin. It's a molecule that engages a receptor on a cell and use this? All right. All right, I'm almost there. It's not going to work. All right, I'm almost done. Here's what's creepy, and this is especially interesting to me because I study this molecule. Beta defensin is an immune molecule that's designed to kill bacteria, fungi, and viruses. It has no business being here, and yet here it is. The same modules are being used over and over for very, very different purposes. And when you look at biology, you find it everywhere. In fact, I'm a discoverer of one of these things. People who know me know I'm known for something. What I'm known for is discovering that a molecule called antitrypsin, which is involved in helping lung tissues, is the most powerful anti-AIDS protein ever discovered. And people said, what the heck is going on here? As it turns out, it was true. And in fact, they've developed biotech molecules that actually work to treat HIV. Closer? Is that better? All right. Question, here I'm going to open to the audience. Look at this. And look at that. What are you looking at? So here's show and tell. Viruses. Anyone else? That's the answer I wanted. Thank you. You'd think it's a virus, wouldn't you? It's not. Ooh. Shh. It's not that either. It's something called a carboxysome. It's a little thing inside of a bacterium that fixes CO2 or carbon. It's a protein factory that's sitting inside cells, and it uses the same structure, the same shape, and the same proteins that viruses use. Modules. Modules. My final slide. Here is my own conception of how evolution may work. I don't claim to know. If I'm right, I take full credit. If I'm wrong, I never said a word. You have Big Bang. I've never seen this show, but I've heard it's good. In the beginning, there were laws of physics, mathematics, determinism, and information. And the blueprint for life, I think, came in with the rest of it. Just like the blueprint for laws of gravity, how they interact, constants of the universe. Well, then you have a bunch of planets. Some of them are class M planets, for those who remember Star Trek, this guy here. And on those class M planets, which have the right conditions, you get molecular evolution, or abiogenesis, where everything becomes carbon-based, amino acids, nucleic acids, and the genetic code is established. Then you get life. Luca is the last universal common ancestor, the first living thing on the planet. Then you get exceptionless regularities start to develop. Carbon-based amino acids, ATP, and all that. Then you get phenotype modules that become established. The DNA, the molecules, the behaviors, all become established at this point in evolution, and they multiply and they recombine. Then the modules become rearranged. Ultimately, they're genetic, of course, and they're finite. That's the key, they're finite. That's why they keep being reused over and over. That accounts for parallel evolution. That's what accounts for exceptionless regularities. It also accounts for artificial selection. If you're breeding racehorses, you're selecting for the modules that make animals fast. And you're not letting any of the other modules contaminate your speedy horses. Then, of course, you get diversity. An interesting implication of this model, there's a limit. After the modules can only combine in certain numbers of ways, and the amount of diversity just stops happening. I think that's what we're seeing. Everybody says evolution is happening all around us. I don't believe it, and I'll tell you why. Bacteria, let me tell you how fast they replicate. If I took one E. coli, a big one, and I put it here, and I let it replicate without any impediments, it will cover the earth a foot deep in 36 hours. 36 hours, that's how fast. These guys have been replicating trillions and trillions and trillions of times since the dawn of history. And yet they don't change very much. They really don't. I have a feeling they don't because they can't. It's not like there's infinite alterations in the genome and the phenotypes. It doesn't work that way. I really believe that's why I have those cutoffs there, that there is a limit to the diversity of life. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think the modules can only, remember, they can only combine in a certain number of ways. And, most importantly, that's the end. That makes sense? Do you have to get questions?
I got one for you.
Oh, God. Here we go.
Why did you run the batteries out in your mic?
Is that what it was? I don't know. I don't speak loud. It has to, the gain had to be turned up.
So I have a question for you.
Oh, God. All right.
So I didn't notice any horizontal gene transfer. Do you think that's possible, not possible, and how would that affect the mutation?
Well, I didn't, because remember, I wanted to cover a lot of material, which I think I did superficially. Horizontal gene transfer is not only known, it's downright boring, especially in my field, infectious diseases, plasmids, all kinds of F factors. Bacteria pass genetic material around all the time. even in our genome, jumping genes that you're well aware of, our genome is moving around all the time as well. We don't have horizontal transfer the way they do. But that just makes my point. Basically, I'm saying that there are very large, these are not random events. Whole big chunks of DNA are moving around either within the same genome or from one to the other. These are the modules that are generating all of this stuff I'm talking about. So far from being an exception, that's the rule. I think that's exactly, thank you for making my point.
Okay.
There's a whole shelf full of books by the two guys that you mentioned not to look at. Is there anybody that we ought to read?
Lassos. Lassos. Is this working now? God, it's all right. Is that okay? Yeah, Lassos.
And is he readable by a non-PhD?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's one of the best books on evolutionary biology I've ever read, and Randy Bancroft will agree. He's really good. He's really attuned to how weird this is. Very, very good. The other guys, not so much. Uh-oh. This is trouble.
So I spent all morning long Googling in preparation for
Next
this.
question.
No. I'm going to actually give you 2 comments and 2
Sure.
recommendations. Question, it would be senseless because in a consistent basis, I counted 8 times. That if I don't agree with you, don't go into science. So I'm not going to go into science because I don't agree with you 100%. So was there any value to Darwin, to anything?
Yes, I said that. What he did that was very important was he moved evolution, which is changes of organisms over time, out of the purview of religion and into the scope of science.
Perfect.
That's very, very important.
So I like your very last graph that you showed. Can you bring it back?
Oh, bring it back. This one.
So when we spend about 55 minutes an hour debunking everything, almost everything that Darwin says, could you have derived this without his help?
Probably.
Really?
I do believe that. I think Darwin actually tells you that this can't happen. Everything is random. Natural selection is this weird filter. He had nothing about genetics. No, I mean, it's not his fault, but they didn't know anything.
There wasn't anything. I mean, it's like pushing myself back into one of my friends that 10 years ago didn't know what he knows now, and criticizing him for what he didn't know then. And I had the advantage that I know some more stuff. So
right, it's like by standing on the shoulders of giants. I have seen. I know.
Okay. So those are my comments. But now my suggestions. You were saying that you couldn't find a good example of the fittest. Who is the fittest? What the fittest is about, and how you define the fittest. There is actually a show that maybe you shouldn't watch, but it's called. I think it's called Naked and Afraid. That show, right? And empirically, in a consistent basis, every week is the same thing. Some of the people do not survive, or they quit before that. But there's a pattern that I have seen. The pattern is attitude. Sometimes it's people that don't have the right qualities to be social people, and they have the wrong attitude. They don't survive, and they don't show to be the fittest. Some of these people are marine. Some of these people are very successful things. And so empirical, you can actually see who the fittest is in somewhat the empirical ways. Of course, they're naked, so.
And then you have Donald Trump.
True that. That's the stuff of my rant. Who wants to be?
As long as we're talking about fitness, I had a chance to look up real quick. No, what evolutionary biologists would call fitness is merely is the ability to or how successfully they reproduce.
Sure.
It's not who's the fastest, who's the prettiest.
Why do they reproduce?
Successful.
Okay. Some reproduce more than others. Why?
Mm-hmm. It's the success of reproduction.
Why? Why does one animal?
Because you're increasing the probability that species, that genotype, will continue.
Okay. I'm well aware of that definition of fitness, and my response is it begs the question. Here's why. Who gets to produce more offspring? The fast one? The smart one? Maybe humans do better because the chances of our offspring surviving are greater than others. Or maybe it's because they can echolocate like a bat. Or maybe it's because they replicate like E. coli and can tolerate a huge amount of mortality. My point is that if you go to basic biology, they'll say, yeah, it's all about how many offspring you produce. That's the definition. That's the classic.
But you're passing the genotype on.
Yeah, but why? Why are you passing the genotype? Why do you
Stan,
pass the genotype on?
The question isn't why,
and you
it's how.
don't? No, but how come he passes genotype on and he doesn't? What does he have that she doesn't have? That's the problem I have. I want to know why. And I don't have that here. I just have, how do I know who's better? I come back in 50 years and he's got 3 kids and he has 1, so he's more fit.
Maybe it
not
has
a
to do
judgment.
not with 1 or 2 or 3 variables. Maybe it has to do with 100 variables or so many variables that they're either extremely difficult or at this point impossible for us to measure.
Variables for what? Fitness? Yeah, I mean, well, there are a couple ways of going with this. I want to know what the rules, the regularities, the calculus of fitness is. I want to know. Now, maybe you're right. I hope you're wrong. Maybe you're right. There are so many variables. There are so many things that factor in it that we might as well give up. And again, if you give up, science may not be your No. What I'm saying is if that's right, then I think you're saying maybe we can't do it. It's too complicated. I'm more optimistic than that. Can you believe I said the word optimistic referring to me? I think things are complicated until they're not. Just like when people looked at the solar systems, it was just pure chaos. I have no idea why these things seem to go with this periodicity. And then all of a sudden it became very simple when a guy named Newton came along. This field needs Newton, and it needs it now. And when that happens, I think a lot of these problems will go away. But until we have that, I think we've got some problems.
It seems like we've only been able to even think on these things for 100 or so years. And it's kind of like us stumbling on the Enterprise and saying, oh, well, I understand how the reactors work with the whatever they are. But, then you don't know how the computers work as we look closer and closer to all the finely designed instruments inside, perhaps a little more about the cell.
And
That stuff.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think we're now where the ancients were back then looking at solar systems. And we're doing that. When we see evolution, we see what they saw. Someone has to design a new theory that has the better regularities, better explanations, better predictions of what's going to happen with evolutionary observation. And then I think we're going to make real progress. By the way, when it comes to the complexity, I didn't show you anything compared to what's actually out there. I work in my own field, which I retreat to because I know it best, because that's what I do. That's what puts food on the table. The mechanisms that bacteria use to develop resistance to antibiotics will astound you. I'll give you an example. There's a new class of antibiotics called cefideromycin, and there's a new drug called cefiderocol. Let me tell you how cefiderocol works. The weird thing about this is it's based on a natural product. It was out there in the world first. This molecule floats around and grabs iron. Okay? It kind of knows that the bacteria like iron. So the bacterium is programmed to suck iron inside of it. And it gets sucked inside the bacterium. And then inside the bacterium there's an enzyme called a serine protease that happens to chop off the warhead of this weird antibiotic and activates it inside the cell. Then it kills the bacterium. By the way, all with one exception. Antibiotics are natural products. You ever wonder why no matter what antibiotic you use, there's always resistance? Superbugs, you've all CRE and all carbapenemase-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. We all heard about these. The reason there's always a bug waiting out there is because that resistance didn't develop. You don't give an antibiotic and a bug makes some hugely complicated molecule. It was there all the time. You're selecting the one bug in 10 million that already had the resistance. It's already out there. We're exploiting stuff that's been going on for billions of years. You may wonder if there could be an antibiotic that there could be no resistance to. The closest one we have is vancomycin. It's peculiar because it looks like when the bug becomes resistant, it has a fitness cost. It loses the ability to replicate efficiently. Those are the kind of things I want to know. I want to know what is it that makes the thing fit? Like the bug is faster or stronger or whatever. I want to know those rules, those regularities, so I can design an antibiotic that targets exactly the right regularities, like a laser, that the thing can't get around. And those are the kind of things I want. I want to know the rules, the principles, the regularities that run through biology. It sounds like a tall order, but I already pointed out there's a whole bunch. Every single thing on this planet uses ATP as the currency of energy. Every single thing. That's peculiar. That's really peculiar. And to my mind, scientists would want to know why that exists.
No, I agree.
Exceptionless
Not just because I don't agree with everything you say.
No.
You just push me out of sight.
You can. I didn't say that.
You said cover 8 times. If you don't agree with me.
Not quite.
Sorry, I'd like to go back to this area of fitness. If you look at the viability of a business and whether it's going to be successful or not, you've got thousands of variables, and in fact, nobody can really be sure beforehand which is going to be a success. But there is a criteria of success. It's a real. I mean, as you say, it's very complex. You don't know the etiology. You don't know how it's going to work, but there's a criterion, and you can say that if it's successful, it was successful. If a species survives, then it was fit enough to survive.
Why? Well, why did it survive?
Well, but you might not know why the business. I mean, the business you can look in retrospect and say yes, it was this and this and this, but beforehand you might not be able to say that. That doesn't invalidate the criterion that it was successful, that it's fit.
Well, let's back up. First of all, that's not natural selection; it's artificial selection.
Yep.
In fact, Darwin was very careful to say his first goal was religion. He had another goal. The other goal was getting around artificial selection or breeding. He said that's called artificial selection, where you're intervening and you are setting up the rules saying only the fat pigs are going to survive, are going to kill the rest. And sure enough, you develop fat pigs. And he said what natural selection is, the world is doing it. The world is the filter. The problem there is you don't know what that filter looks like. I didn't show it to you here, but I had an example very much like that, and Randy saw it. Baseball. Everybody wants to be a baseball player. Shaving commercials, money, who knows? The problem is, what is it that allows someone to be a good baseball player? Well, it's hard to know. Some are fast. Some are smart. Some have a desire to win. Some have really good eyesight. Some have good coordination. What's weird is that there's a little bit of predictability in that. And I actually have the data on this. It's really interesting. So it turns out people who play baseball, about 85% of them have 20/15 vision or better. Like, are you kidding me? That's kind of predicted. You'd expect that because when the ball is going at 100 miles an hour, you better have good vision. But that's an artificial system. We invented baseball to, in a sense, bias it towards some definitions of fitness, but not all. To give you an idea of where the exceptions are, Jake Peavy was a pitcher with vision of 2300, and yet he won 2 Cy Young Awards and one MVP. So my point is that even in things like baseball, simple things that we select, where we make all the rules, it's very hard to predict exactly who's going to survive the filter and who is not. It's 20 times harder to invoke that in the natural world where anything goes. And really, anything goes. Animals find all kinds of very strange ways of surviving and so-called filling niches. And even within that, you see these bizarre regularities where they all go down the same path. So the answer is, I understand where remember, artificial selection, the things that human beings do intentionally, you're playing God when you build a business in a sense. You are the intentional entity that's setting the ground rules. The point that Darwin made is...
But you don't necessarily know your environment. You're guessing at your environment. Just like an animal there's a variation, and does this work in this environment? In another environment, it might be exactly the answer. But in this environment, it is or it isn't.
Well, if you're going to have a business that's based on people staying up 15 hours a night to work in the business, I can tell you something about those people. People who who have trouble staying up are not going to survive in that context. People who are night owls may survive in that context. There are no criteria like that you can invoke in the natural world. We don't know what the relevant filters are in the natural world that allow some to survive and some not to survive. I know you don't like the answer. I can see that. But remember, if you look at Darwin in the text, he will tell you specifically he is not dealing with artificial selection or breeding. When you set up a business, in a sense, you are inducing breeding. You are selecting for the kinds of things that really, if you're going to be a doctor, if you don't have more than a 4th grade education, is that they're going to make it? If not, why not? Why not?
I certainly agree that the question of how you arrive at being fit enough is very complicated, and there are too many variables that you can. But nevertheless, when you see that an animal does survive, then it is arrived. When a business is successful, somehow it did it. You may not know all the variables. I mean, the variables have to do with fashion, have to do with things going on in the society that are completely unpredictable or very difficult to predict.
Here I'm having a hard time understanding the point. I mean, I'm going to say two things. I'm an optimist. I don't believe that it's too complicated. I believe that once you know what the regularities are, I think we can figure it out. I really believe that. Where you can actually go back to my cheetahs and say, I know that one's going to survive because fast animals have an edge, and here's why. Now, when you come to what you're getting at, let's say the jellyfish. Why does the jellyfish survive? Is it the stingers? The ability to swim? Is it some behavioral trait? Is it bioluminescence? Is it longevity? What is it? In other words, I want to know what is it about it? What are the criteria? What are the rules? What are the regularities that permit one animal to make it and the other one not?
I don't want to take everything over, but I mean, it just seems that it's a very complex system, and that you're not going to be able to. But that doesn't invalidate the sort of the measurable criterion that it does survive.
Yeah, it does survive. That's that's exactly the problem. That is the criterion. The criterion of fitness is survival. That's right. Okay. Why do they survive? Well, they're fit. Well, how do you know they're fit? They survive. It doesn't tell you anything about what the mechanism of survival. I want to know the mechanism. I want to know the why. That's what scientists do. Not all. No.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to break for cake.
Well, I would argue that the
Convergent recurrent evolution, Groundhog Day?
No, not Groundhog Day.
Sure
Convergent evolution, it is maybe I shouldn't say proof, but an argument for natural selection. If species across the planet from each other that evolve into very similar either behavior or appearance or function.
What are the odds of that? What are the odds?
Natural selection.
Natural selection doesn't tell you what they're going to do to survive. It just tells that they will survive, that the ones who survive are the ones.
I think you're making a circular argument.
No.
You keep saying fit. Well, why is fit survival? I'm jumbling my words, and I'm sorry about that. But you're making circular arguments about why is fit survival, why is it not?
Well, actually, it's not my argument. I put reference. I mean, I'm not. The weird thing about all this is I'm not the only one saying these things. These things are all through the literature, and it's all through many of the books that I mentioned here. I thought it was a novel idea, but it's not. It's basically everywhere. The problem with parallel evolution is, take the 3 lizards I mentioned who are on different islands. They evolve over time, which is a real thing, to fill identical niches in an identical way with the exact same phenotype. It's like, let me give you an example. There is no mechanism I can come up with that randomly allows you to do that. It's like you're in a football field and there's a dartboard and you're blind and you throw the dart and you hit the bullseye. Pretty unlikely. Then you do it again. Then you do it again. Then you do it again. At some point you say, wait a minute, this isn't random stuff going on. There's no way. There's something that's guiding or restricting what is happening here. Like if you walked into a casino and a guy rolls 50 times in a row, you would say, no, something's going on here. This is not random. There is nothing I can think about that restricts the space of random possibilities for behaviors or genes or proteins. It's like I showed you one tiny little receptor. You have thousands of them. And that's not even as complicated as behavior, like the wasp I showed you. If you think that there are principles that are restricting it, I agree with you. I want to know what they are. Whatever they are, it's not random. It's something else going on. There's something happening here, and it's not just trial and error. And I think the burden is on people who adhere to strict Darwinism to tell me why that happens. I don't believe that parallel evolution or recurrent evolution is a real problem here. I don't see how things stumble upon the same solutions over and over and over and over again. If you look at the molecular changes that an animal has to undergo to make an eye or anything, it's staggering. The odds are 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. They're not, ultimately. But I want to know why they're not. I want to know the why. What's restricting things and guiding things without being a deist.
Thank you very much.